There is something most people misunderstand about the empath personality early in life. They assume sensitivity is fragility. They assume emotional depth means vulnerability without strength. They look at the empath, especially when they're young, and see someone who feels too much, trusts too easily, absorbs too deeply, and breaks too often. And for a while, even the empath may believe that story. But what looks like weakness in the beginning is often the early formation of a very unusual kind of power. Because many empaths do not begin life in emotional ease. They begin in tension, in unpredictability, in environments where reading the emotional atmosphere was not optional but necessary. They learned to scan facial expressions before they could explain why. They sensed shifts in tone before anyone else noticed something was wrong. They became highly attuned to contradiction, what people said versus what they actually felt. And while others were simply moving through life, the empath was studying human behavior at a level most people never consciously reach. Now here's where this becomes important. What we call emotional pain, when endured consciously, often becomes perception. And perception over time becomes wisdom. That difficult childhood, that repeated misunderstanding, that constant experience of feeling too much, it doesn't just wound an empath, it trains them quietly, invisibly. It forces an internal development that many people postpone for decades or avoid altogether, because pain has a way of asking deeper questions. Who can I trust? Why do people hurt others? What is real beneath appearances? What protects peace? What actually matters? And the empath, unlike many personalities, doesn't just ask those questions intellectually. They live inside them. They wrestle with them. They search for answers, not in abstract theories, but in lived emotional reality. That changes a person. This is why many empaths appear unusually wise later in life. Not because they were handed wisdom, but because suffering demanded it from them. Think about what happens psychologically when someone repeatedly survives betrayal, disappointment, exclusion, or emotional chaos. One possibility is bitterness, but another possibility, and this is where the empath often evolves differently, is refinement. They begin to distinguish noise from truth, performance from sincerity, charm from character, attention from love, and these distinctions are forms of intelligence. Most people think intelligence is measured by what you can calculate, but there is another intelligence born through hardship, the ability to recognize patterns in human nature. Empaths often develop that early, and what begins as hyper-awareness, sometimes even anxiety, can mature into extraordinary discernment. The child who had to read danger in a room becomes the adult who can read motives. The person who once overanalyzed everyone's emotions becomes the person who understands complex human dynamics. Instinctively, the one who was wounded by deception becomes the one rarely fooled by it again. That is not weakness evolving. That is sensitivity becoming calibrated power. And here is something even deeper. Struggle often strips empaths of superficial ambitions earlier than others. They tend to confront existential questions younger. While others may spend years pursuing status, approval, or image, empaths often become disillusioned with those things sooner because they've already seen how empty appearances can be. That disillusionment can feel painful in youth, but later it becomes liberation, because when you stop worshiping what is shallow, you begin building on what is real, and power built on what is real lasts. This is why later in life many empaths possess a gravity others can feel. It is not loud, it is not performative, it is not dominance, it is depth. And depth carries authority. People trust them because they sense they are speaking from something earned, not borrowed, earned, through heartbreak, through observation, through surviving things that force them inward. And there is enormous strength in people who have gone inward and returned with understanding. This is what the world often misses when it misjudges the empath in the early chapters. It mistakes sensitivity for unfinished strength, when in reality, sensitivity is often strength in formation. Because to feel deeply and still remain compassionate is strength. To be hurt and still choose wisdom over vengeance is strength. To endure confusion and keep searching for truth is strength. And perhaps greatest of all, to turn suffering into understanding instead of becoming hardened by it, that is rare strength. That is transformative strength. The empath's early pain often creates what philosophers have spoken about for centuries, the examined life. And the examined life produces something extraordinary. It produces people who are difficult to manipulate, difficult to deceive, difficult to intimidate, because they have already wrestled with deeper things. And people who have faced deeper things are rarely controlled by shallow forces. That is why the empath often becomes powerful later, not despite the struggle, but because of what the struggle developed. The very experiences that made them feel different, too sensitive, too burdened, were often shaping capacities the world would one day need: discernment, compassion, psychological insight, moral clarity, inner steadiness. These are not accidental traits. These are forged traits. And forged things tend to be stronger than manufactured ones. So if you are in the stage where sensitivity still feels like a burden, understand this: what feels like pain may also be preparation. What feels like isolation may be depth forming. What feels like being misunderstood may be the cost of developing a perception others have not yet grown into. And one day, what once made you feel weak may become the very source of your authority. Because the empath does not become powerful when life stops hurting them. The empath becomes powerful when they realize the pain was teaching them how to see. And once you learn to truly see, very little in this world can control you. There comes a point in the empath's life when exhaustion becomes revelation. And this is a turning point many people never see coming. Because younger empaths often believe love means endless accommodation. They believe being good means always understanding others, always forgiving quickly, always making room for someone else's wounds, moods, or dysfunction. They overextend because they confuse empathy with responsibility. They assume that if they can feel another person's pain, they are obligated to carry it. And for a while, they live this way. They overexplain to people committed to misunderstanding them. They overgive to people who only know how to take. They stay loyal to those who repeatedly violate trust. They tolerate emotional confusion in the name of compassion. And often they do this believing they are preserving peace. But they are not preserving peace. They are financing dysfunction. And sooner or later, reality makes that impossible to ignore. Because emotional overextension always carries a cost. It drains clarity. It erodes self-respect. It creates resentment disguised as patience. And perhaps most dangerously, it teaches others that access to you requires no accountability. Now pay attention, because this is where power begins. Empaths do not usually become bounded because someone taught them healthy boundaries early. They become bounded because betrayal educates them, because repeated exploitation teaches what theory never could, because one day they realize something psychologically profound. Compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. That realization changes everything, because the empath begins separating kindness from submission. This is a massive evolutionary shift. Before this point, they often believe saying no is cruelty. Distance feels like guilt. Silence feels like rejection. Self-protection feels selfish. But maturity exposes the illusion. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls against love. They are structures that make healthy love possible. And once an empath sees this, their entire way of relating changes. They stop answering every emotional demand placed upon them. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to twisting their words. They stop trying to heal people who are invested in remaining wounded. And most importantly, they stop confusing access with intimacy. That distinction is life-changing, because not everyone who has access to you deserves closeness. Not everyone who seeks your energy honors your value. And not everyone who asks for understanding offers reciprocity. Younger empaths often learn this painfully. Older empaths embody it quietly. And this is where a new kind of strength appears. Not dramatic strength. Not aggressive strength, selective strength, measured strength, the power to withhold energy where there is no integrity. That is enormous power, because attention is power. Access is power. Emotional availability is power. And mature empaths stop giving those things away indiscriminately. They become intentional, and intentionality changes how others experience them. Manipulative people often lose interest when empathy gains boundaries. Why? Because exploitation depends on predictability. It depends on knowing you will always over-explain, always return, always forgive without repair, always sacrifice yourself to keep the relationship intact. But boundaries interrupt that script. And once the script breaks, unhealthy dynamics lose their control. This is why people sometimes react negatively when an empath becomes stronger. They say, "You've changed." They don't, that's the point. Growth always looks threatening to those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Remember that. The empath begins to realize peace is not created by keeping everyone comfortable. Peace is created by refusing to participate in what destroys you. That is a profound psychological upgrade, and it often comes with a new understanding of energy itself. Because mature empaths stop treating emotional energy as infinite. They recognize attention is a resource, time is a resource, presence is a resource, and where you place those resources shapes your life. This awareness produces a level of discernment many people never reach. They begin asking different questions. Does this relationship nourish or deplete? Does this person respect limits? Does this dynamic require me to abandon myself to maintain it? Does my compassion here create healing or enable harm? Those are powerful questions, and powerful questions produce powerful lives. Because once you ask them honestly, you stop living reactively. You start living consciously, and conscious living is where power lives. Now something else begins happening. The empath stops needing universal approval. This is enormous because people pleasing is often just the survival strategy of someone afraid of disapproval means danger. But as the empath matures, they begin tolerating something they once feared, being misunderstood. And when you can tolerate being misunderstood without betraying yourself, you become extraordinarily difficult to control because manipulation often works through guilt, through obligation, through fear of appearing harsh. But once those levers stop working, external control weakens. And this is where the empath begins developing what looks almost like quiet authority. They speak less but mean more. They explain less but see more. They react less but discern more. Their presence changes because they are no longer trying to be accepted by everyone. They are aligned with something deeper than approval, self-respect. And self-respect alters everything. It changes what you tolerate, what you attract, what you walk away from, and what you refuse to negotiate. This is why later in life, many empaths seem calmer, stronger, almost untouchable compared to who they were before. It is not that they stopped caring. It is that they learned caring without boundaries is chaos. And they chose order, they chose clarity, they chose peace rooted in truth, not performance. And understand something important, this is not the empath becoming cold. This is the empath becoming precise. There is a difference. Coldness shuts down feeling. Precision directs feeling wisely. One is disconnection, the other is mastery. And mature empaths move toward mastery. They stop giving from guilt. They start giving from choice. They stop saying yes to preserve relationships. They say yes only where truth and reciprocity exist. That is not withdrawal. That is evolution. And once an empath learns their energy is sacred, their life begins changing in ways outsiders rarely understand. Because protecting your energy does not make you less loving. It makes your love honest. It makes your presence valuable. It makes your compassion sustainable. And perhaps for the first time, it allows you to give without disappearing. That is real power, because the moment an empath stops believing self-sacrifice is virtue and starts believing self-respect is necessary, everything changes. And here is the truth worth remembering. The people who deserve your light will never demand you burn yourself to keep them warm. There is a profound shift that happens when empathic sensitivity matures. And most people misunderstand this transformation because they assume sensitivity is static. They think if you are deeply feeling, highly perceptive, emotionally attuned, then you remain forever vulnerable to overwhelm. But that is only true in the early stages, before experience sharpens perception. Because with time, something remarkable happens. What once felt like emotional overload begins organizing itself into discernment. And discernment is power. When empaths are young, they often absorb everything without filters. They feel tension in a room, but may not understand its source. They sense dishonesty, but doubt their own instincts. They notice contradictions in people, but often rationalize them away in the name of compassion. Their sensitivity is active but untrained, and untrained sensitivity can feel chaotic. But life trains it, experience trains it, disappointment trains it, and slowly, the empath begins to move from merely feeling human behavior to interpreting it. That is a different level of awareness, because now they are no longer simply reacting to emotional currents. They are reading patterns. And human beings are patterns. Patterns in speech, patterns in contradiction, patterns in insecurity, patterns in hidden motives, patterns in what people do under pressure. Most people miss these things because they focus on surface presentation. They listen to words. They respond to image. They are persuaded by performance. But mature empaths often begin perceiving beneath performance. And once you perceive beneath performance, you stop being easily deceived by it. That is not intuition in the mystical sense people often romanticize. That is psychological pattern recognition, and it is extraordinarily powerful because the empath who has lived long enough begins noticing things almost instantly. They notice when charm is rehearsed, when praise has an agenda, when guilt is being used as leverage, when silence is strategic, when vulnerability is being performed rather than genuinely expressed. These are not supernatural gifts. These are perceptions sharpened by exposure. And what repeated exposure creates is discernment. Now think about how rare this becomes. In a world where many are influenced by appearances, the person who can accurately read underlying dynamics has enormous advantage. That advantage often appears as calm, because people who understand patterns are rarely shocked by behavior. They may be disappointed, but they are not naive. And there is power in not being naive, because naivete makes people controllable. Discernment makes people free. This is why later in life, many empaths become extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Not because they become suspicious of everyone, but because they become accurate. That is a critical distinction. Suspicion sees threats everywhere. Discernment sees clearly. One is fear, the other is perception. And mature empaths move toward perception. They stop assuming everyone is good because they themselves have good intentions. This is one of the hardest lessons they learn. Because early in life, many empaths project their own sincerity onto others. They assume others operate with similar conscience, similar depth, similar emotional honesty, and that assumption creates vulnerability. But life corrects it. And once corrected, the empath develops something extraordinary, the ability to separate appearance from essence, to distinguish who performs warmth from who embodies integrity, who seeks connection from who seeks access, who speaks truth from who manages impressions. That level of discernment creates influence, because people trust those who see clearly. And trust is one of the foundations of quiet authority. Now notice something else. As empaths mature, they often stop needing to prove their perception. This is a major psychological evolution. Younger empaths often argue when they sense deception. They try to convince others what they see. They over-explain their concerns. They seek validation for instincts they secretly doubt. But older empaths often do something entirely different. They observe. They register. And they adjust accordingly, without drama, without needing consensus, without needing permission. That is enormous strength, because the person who trusts their discernment no longer wastes energy trying to make blind people see. They simply move differently. And this is where quiet authority begins. Emerging, not authority based on status, not authority based on dominance, authority based on psychological clarity. People feel this. They may not even know why they trust certain individuals, but they do, because there is a steadiness in people who are no longer confused by appearances, a precision, a groundedness, a refusal to be emotionally pulled by every performance around them. That steadiness has influence, and often mature empaths begin becoming advisors, guides, protectors, or leaders not because they sought power, but because people instinctively seek out those who see what others miss. This happens in friendships, in families, in organizations, even in silence. Sometimes the most powerful person in a room is not the loudest voice. It is the one who understands the room. And empaths matured through life often become exactly that person, because sensitivity, once disciplined by experience, does not remain mere sensitivity. It becomes social intelligence, strategic intelligence, relational intelligence, and those forms of intelligence shape outcomes. Now, this is where it becomes philosophical, because what we call wisdom is often just perception integrated with restraint, seeing clearly and responding deliberately, not impulsively, not emotionally hijacked, deliberately. And many empaths grow into precisely this. They stop reacting to every provocation. They stop trying to expose every deception. They stop fighting battles that reveal themselves over time. They understand something deeper. Truth often does not need defending. It needs patience. That realization changes how power is expressed, because immature power reacts. Mature power discerns. Immature power seeks to dominate. Mature power sees further. And empaths, after enough experience, often move into that second form. This is why their influence can feel almost invisible, yet profound. They are not controlling people. They are understanding them, and understanding is often the greater. Power, because when you understand motives, you stop being ruled by appearances. When you understand patterns, you stop being surprised by cycles. When you understand human nature, you stop taking every behavior personally. And when you stop taking everything personally, you become emotionally sovereign. That may be one of the highest forms of power there is, because sovereignty means your center is no longer easily disturbed by chaos around you. And people with inner sovereignty are rare. They are hard to intimidate, hard to seduce with false praise, hard to destabilize with manipulation, because they are operating from perception, not confusion. And this is what life often gives the empath later, not merely deeper feeling, but deeper seeing. And deeper seeing changes everything. It changes relationships, decisions, boundaries, influence, even identity. Because at some point, the empath stops seeing sensitivity as something to manage and starts recognizing it as something refined. A faculty, an intelligence, a strength. And once that happens, what once made them vulnerable becomes part of what makes them formidable. Because in the end, power does not belong only to those who can control others. Real power belongs to those who can see clearly enough that others cannot control them. And once your sensitivity becomes discernment, your presence begins changing outcomes before you even speak. There is a final transformation that often marks the empath's deepest power, and it does not happen when they become harder. It happens when they become whole. This is where many people get it wrong. They assume strength is the result of emotional armor. They assume the wounded become powerful only by becoming cold, detached, or unreachable. They assume healing means learning not to feel. But for the empath, real power often emerges in the opposite direction. Not through abandoning sensitivity, but through owning it completely. Because there comes a moment, usually after enough. Betrayal, enough self-questioning, enough years spent shrinking to survive, when the empath stops trying to become acceptable to people who only valued smaller versions of them. And that changes everything. Because for much of early life, many empaths live in adaptation. They soften truths to avoid conflict. They suppress instincts to avoid seeming difficult. They dim intensity to avoid intimidating others. They question their perceptions when those perceptions threaten the comfort of people around them. In other words, they often survive by self-reduction. And self-reduction is exhausting, because there is a psychological cost to living divided against your own nature. A cost to knowing what you feel, what you perceive, what you value, and continually betraying it to preserve belonging. Eventually, the empath feels that fracture. And one day, often quietly, something shifts. They decide the cost of self-abandonment is greater than the cost of being misunderstood. That decision is revolutionary because it marks the end of survival as identity and the beginning of self-possession. Now pay attention, because this is where power reaches a deeper level. Up to this point, the empath may have developed wisdom through pain, boundaries through betrayal, discernment through experience. But here something even greater happens: integration. And integration is where fragmented strength becomes unified power. Because before integration, the empath may know their worth intellectually, yet still hesitate to embody it. They may understand boundaries, yet still apologize for enforcing them. They may perceive truth, yet still fear speaking it. But when integration occurs, these contradictions begin dissolving. Their inner knowing and outer expressions start matching. And when inner truth and outer action align, there is tremendous force in that. Because alignment creates conviction, and conviction has gravity. People feel it, not because it is announced, but because it is. Embodied, this is when the empath stops asking permission to be who they are. And that may be one of the most powerful psychological thresholds a human being can cross. Because much of social control depends on insecurity. It depends on making people doubt their perceptions, doubt their worth, doubt their right to take up space. But once the empath no longer participates in that self-doubt, those mechanisms lose power. And what emerges is not aggression. It is presence, presence without apology, presence without performance, presence without shrinking. That is rare, and rarity carries power. Now, something else happens here that is deeply important. The empath stops defining themselves through what wounded them. This is critical because trauma often creates identity traps. People begin seeing themselves primarily as rejected, betrayed, used, misunderstood. And while those experiences may be real, when they become identity, they imprison growth. But mature empaths often break that. pattern. They stop organizing life around what hurt them and begin organizing life around what they choose. That is freedom, because power is not merely surviving pain. It is refusing to let pain become the author of who you are. And once the empath understands this, something remarkable happens. The wounds that once produced shame begin producing meaning.